The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host who has read these books before and is now really excited we're getting towards the things that I told my wife when we started recording this podcast. Yay, the good stuff is coming in a year and a half. It's almost here, y'all. And I, of course, am joined by Greg, who is probably very annoyed that the only thing I say when he asks me about this book series is just wait, only a year and a half to go. Greg, how are you holding up as we now approach the end of this third book?
Man, I'm still waiting to find out what our podcast is named after. And I know you had promised that's coming in March. And so I continue to await with bated breath. I already shared this on our social media. So the devotees who follow us on Instagram know this. But I went out and I bought, hey, look at that. The fourth book he holds up to have a visual gag on a non-visual medium. So we are cruising right along, and we are preparing ourselves to continue on into the fourth book. Tylor, why don't you walk through exactly how we're going to treat the end of this season as we begin to think about The Shadow Rising, our next book?
Yeah, we need to think about The Shadow Rising. I'm very excited for you all to read this book. After this week, we will have 3 more weeks to cover The Dragon Reborn. So that is going to be the last 2 weeks in November and the first Wednesday in December. We will be doing, just as we usually have, a couple of chapters a week as normal with the drops. The week after that, I believe that will be December 13th, we will be dropping an episode that is just kind of a recap of the entirety of The Dragon Reborn, discussing our feelings about the book overall, and also going over things like prophecies that got lost at the end of the last book that I really want to make sure we are kind of getting an opportunity to chat about. And then we are going to take our customary 2-week winter break. We will be understanding of all of you being way too busy during the holidays to pick up a giant first chapter of The Shadow Rising. Oh my God, that first chapter is enormous. And so that means that the first chance that we will have to go over book 4 of The Wheel of Time will be the beginning of January. Looking at my calendar, I believe that is January 3rd. We will be dropping that episode. And for all of you who are listening in the past, welcome back. You've just skipped the last minute of recap. You're just listening to a podcast at some point in the future. Enjoy once we start talking about these chapters. Unless you had anything else to add about the scheduling, Greg, I actually had a question for you about how you were feeling about these chapters. Any last kind of housekeeping before we kind of do the regular introduction?
Only that people should go out and buy their copy of Shadow Rising, or figure out they're going to listen to it on audio. Get ready for that as we prepare. And I'll just throw in, we had talked a little bit about, usually as devotees will know, we usually just roll into kind of the end of the book after the last couple chapters. But we thought we'd change it up this time. We've got some visual discussions, and just like Tylor said, we don't want to kind of neglect the fact, and we want to celebrate that we got to the end of another book, and all of you have joined us this far. So if you want to reach out and share some thoughts as you approach the end of the book, or some questions you want us to answer, the best place to do it is on Instagram. Just shoot us a DM, and I'll make sure before we record that last episode that I look through those messages and pull up whatever you want. So we're at Through the Glass Columns on Instagram. If it seems like you message us and I don't find it, then you can always hit me up personally at Ion Cannon, EYEONCANON. Thank you to people who do reach out. I swear my neglect is more being a father and a full-time educator, and not because I don't like what you say to me. We just had a great new follower reach out, and it was really nice to have a conversation with somebody who's listening. And we've reached a level where it's not just our friends and family listening, which is really nice to hear from strangers, or in this case, someone I had not met before was like, "Oh, I actually know your wife," and I'm like, "Oh, great." Make me feel less because I'm always second banana to her, but that's fine. That's how it is. So please keep doing so. Tyler, ask me a question.
First off, should this podcast have been called Second Banana to My Wife? Because that applies to both of us much of the time. But second, we're kind of talking about wrapping up this book. We've only got a few weeks left. And I feel like these two chapters we just read, a first-time reader could have one of two responses to them. And I'm curious where you're at on this continuum. So one response I feel like you could have is like, yes, finally, the characters are in tier. We are seeing what they are doing. This could be like the first moment that you feel like we are kind of at the end of the book instead of building towards something else. I think you could also see this as two chapters that are still moving the pieces around and don't really feel that kind of like big and climactic. And then you look at the top right of your page and you're like, oh my God, there's less than 100 pages left. By the time we're done with these chapters, we only have 3 weeks left. Are you feeling like this is kind of the final burst of momentum that leads us into that kind of climactic finish? Or do you feel like, how is Robert Jordan going to wrap this up in the limited amount of space that he's left himself?
Well, I will just say you are, of course, talking about chapter 48, Following the Craft, and chapter 49, A Storm in Tyr. I steamrolled you and didn't let you say the names of the chapters by extending my introduction. So I will throw those in here in case anybody's confused about where we are. It's chapter 48 and 49. This is not how I think about the Rise of Skywalker, but I just finished a podcast that was going minute by minute through the 9th Skywalker saga film. And they pointed out that there was, at the start of that film, a whole bunch of stuff we had to finish up before we said goodbye to seemingly Star Wars movies forever, or at least the Skywalker saga. And JJ was like, yeah, but hold on. You want to meet Felicity in space? Let's meet Felicity in space. And you want something really cool? Here's a character called Janna. Isn't that really cool? And I would say these chapters felt like that move in that movie, where it's like, oh, I have only 100 pages left. I'm really excited to see where this goes. And we pause and meet new characters. And I will say, in the case of Egwene and somebody else in the second chapter whose name I didn't record.
Sure.
These felt like, oh, this isn't just like somebody we're meeting on the way. This feels important. This feels like somebody we have to care about. So I think that means I am more on the latter side. It's like, here are a couple more pieces we need on the game board as we move forward. And it would strike me that these might go on. As I said, strike me, listeners, my light dimmed and flashed, so it was very dramatic. They might go on in these books. You know, it didn't feel dissimilar to introducing Min or Elaine. And so I'm curious why we needed to do that now, as much as I enjoyed these chapters otherwise. So more in the latter, a slight different take on the latter. I am a little bit like Tyler said, we're not moving super fast.
Yeah, we're not. And I think that's what's so interesting about this book, right? Is that it is simultaneously upsetting a lot of the things that didn't work for me about previous books, right? I think the middle section of this book is just snappier and more exciting than what we were getting at this section of either of the prior two books. But at the same time, I'm kind of getting to this point in this, towards the end of this book, and I'm saying to myself, I just don't feel like this now has picked up the momentum you need to pull off a, Falm kind of big conclusion at the end of the book. And so it's that interesting dynamic of better in the middle, but maybe at the expense of the conclusion. At least it feels like so far, even though we haven't entirely seen the conclusion. Let's not talk too much about these chapters without talking about these chapters, unless you had a final closing thought. Let's talk about chapter 48, Following the Craft.
My closing thought is that you just changed how you said Falme, which means you just spoiled something on the TV show, I think. Something unimportant on the
Just,
TV show.
just the fact that it's called Falm now, it makes me
Ah,
sad.
dang it. These changes annoy me, but all right. Cheer me up with one of your beautiful summaries that warm my heart and let me take a brief nap.
Never once in my life has someone told me that I have warmed their heart. That doesn't sound accurate. Following the craft, Egwene is seasick as she has been traveling along the river, and Nynaeve is even worse off than she is. The captain arrives and tells her that they are docking, and he is clearly glad to be rid of his passengers. They have just been demanding speed and being seasick and nothing else. The girls are passing as non-channelers. They've taken off their rings and are no longer posing as Aes Sedai. And it appears that Egwene has been using the ter'angreal, but hasn't been getting any kind of like strong trips into Teleron Riod. Instead, she has been seeing visions of a white cloak using Master Luhan as bait, of Perrin deciding between an axe and a blacksmith's hammer, of Matt dicing with the Dark One, who is and also shouting, "I am coming," and Egwene believes that he is shouting that directly at her. She also sees Rand walking towards Kalendor, and there are 6 women and 5 men, one of whom is Baelzamon, some of them helping him towards Kalendor and others setting traps. Nynaeve walks out and is getting onto the top of the boat. The deck, that is the word I was looking for. And she is at first clearly very seasick, and then as soon as she notices that Egwene is watching her, she tries to act as if she isn't. They describe the city and say that it kind of feels a lot more plain compared to the other great cities, but the Stone of Tyr kind of towers over everything and is this massive, almost mountain-like structure that it seems impossible was constructed by humans. And Elaine suggests that they find a thief taker in the city that is the most likely way that they would be able to track someone down without needing to go to the officials in the city. Nynaeve insists that they don't stay at an inn. Elaine says that they could use her kind of political power to get a room, but instead Nynaeve kind of takes them through one of the poorer areas of town until she eventually finds a building that has herbs in the window. She goes down the alley, knocks on the door, and she realizes that they have found a healer's home. It is the aforementioned Aelwyn, and she is what is referred to as a wise woman or a mother. And she gives them some tea. Actually, this is Mother Gwenna. Is that Aelwyn? Is that her first name? I don't know. We'll
I think
find out
so.
later on. Probably. She is a mother or a wise woman. She and Nynaeve start bonding, talking about kind of herbs and teas and different ways of healing things. And eventually they kind of start testing each other until eventually they're sharing tips. At this point, Egwene breaks in asking what the point of this conversation was. And Elaine asks kind of what would be done for 2 women who won't stop arguing, which is definitely the case between Egwene and Nynaeve. And she is told what you do is you dunk both women in barrels of water. Egwene seems a little bit sheepish about this, but doesn't really repent at all. And Nynaeve says that they are chasing people who stole things from them and who did murder, and asks for help finding a thief taker and also potentially a place to stay. Once she convinces this woman that she kind of needs to be secret about this and not tell anyone, she basically sends her off, and she leaves to go find the thief taker. At this point, the girls start talking just a little bit about kind of what their plan is and what is going on. And at this point, Egwene gets in a real solid burn against Nynaeve, saying that she manipulates people just as well as Moraine, and Elaine decides that is a step too far and there is not a barrel of water available, so she slaps Egwene in the face. End of chapter. I thought this was one of those really effective moments of Robert Jordan moving the pieces around and kind of burying a character plot in the middle of it to carry you through what could just be they went to an inn, they met a lady, nothing else happened kind of exposition. But I think this is also the part of the book where some people would say Robert Jordan is being heavy-handed with the way that he is portraying kind of like traditional gender roles and cattiness in a way that maybe didn't exist for the young female characters. So where do you come down on chapters like this? I think you can see them either favorably or unfavorably, depending almost on kind of where you're at with the rest of the book, potentially.
Yeah, and specifically where I'm at with this plot. And so, we've now talked, I think, at least 3 or 4 different episodes, not consecutively, about this tension between Nynaeve and Egwene. And I will say every time we come back around to it, I'm always like, where did this come from again? Like, who did what to whom? Because I
Yep.
still have trouble with that early moment where they kind of started them down this path and started explaining that they have this tension. And so I find myself kind of naturally falling into, I think of Frodo carrying the ring, right? Where it's
Yep.
like there's something affecting them, or Matt with the dagger, right? It's like there's something affecting them. And, maybe it's just the exhaustion of all they've been through. I mean, these characters essentially crossed the whole continent between books. And then that was after a whole bunch of traumatic things happened on the other side of the
Yep.
continent, cross the continent, and then have been on the move with high tension, high danger. So it's kind of interesting that I'm always personally looking for that explanation, and then I pause and I'm like, well, it's kind of there. They're just exhausted. Like I get cranky after a long day of like the kind of work I have that from far away looks like I'm not doing work, and yet these people are doing dramatic things. So
Yeah, and I think that that idea of like tension really ratcheting things up makes sense because I think we have kind of the kernel that created this fight or argument or whatever we want to call it. But it's so minor that I think you're right. If it weren't for them just being exhausted and tired, and in this case, nauseous all the time, maybe things wouldn't have developed. But the closest I've got is Egwene now sees herself as Nynaeve's equal. They are both accepted. They are on the same level. And Nynaeve, at least in Egwene's eyes, still treats her as if she is the wisdom and Egwene is the apprentice, and they're not on the same level and she's taking charge. And that's, I think you're exactly right to say, maybe not enough to really justify this level of animosity under normal circumstances. But given what they're going through and the tension of literally hunting 13 women who are more powerful and more knowledgeable than they are, that's terrifying enough to cause an itty bitty tiny thing to become this kind of escalating tension. And I think it's relatively well drawn by Robert Jordan here. There's not a moment where I feel like Egwene feels like a caricature or Nynaeve does in return. It feels kind of earned within the character, even though I think you're right to say it almost feels like it comes out of nowhere given how many other important things are happening around it.
well, and I think part of how you just answered that or replied to me, it wasn't really a question, so you didn't answer. Anyway, I think it makes me think a lot about the central part of this chapter
Yeah.
with Nynaeve and Mother Gwenna, whose first name is L1, whatever we said. You got it. We had clearly both made a different choice in our notes.
Yeah.
And this middle section where they're like, let's talk remedies. And then like I got bored out of my skull fast. And I think the point is that Egwene did too, and was
Yeah.
like, and so that, every once in a while in my teaching in weak moments, some hotshot will come in and like try to say they know everything. And that's when I start dropping my grad school vocabulary. Be like, you
Yep.
don't know everything. And like you know everything that you needed in high school. Good for you. I do think that there's a way in which there's a little of that going on. It's
Yeah.
like pushing back against the we're not equals yet, or we're not equals across all skills, even if Tarvalon says we're equals. So that makes sense to me, and I think that is how I read those scenes, even if I hadn't put it quite in those terms till you said it. Um, and then I will just say it does feel like Mother Gwenna. My notes I say feels like she's gonna stick around. Like this just felt like a little bit more of a character introduction, and I'm
Yeah.
willing to put that down because I'm confident enough that it's either accurate or will be something funny for you to throw in my face 3 books from now when you say her name. I'm like, I don't know who that is. I
Oh,
don't know
buddy.
her.
Some of the funniest predictions you've made are the ones that had no, forward about you might be wrong. You're the best co-host for this. Let me just say that. Uh, I think the thing that really works for me in this section, as we're kind of talking about like Mother Gwenna and Nynaeve, is it feels like all of the girls have suggestions that are logical and work in this chapter, and the ones who are coming out on top are the ones who have the ideas that best fit the situation, right? It feels like Egwene is talking about like we need to tap into these kind of local networks. We need to go to the inn. Elaine knows the only way that she knows how, which is like be famous and get a room at the Stone of Tyr. And then Nynaeve has this approach that clearly seems to work, and that I think is what reads the most kind of the most effectively for me, and what Robert Jordan is doing is he makes you simultaneously go like, yeah, I could see why I would be frustrated with that if I was Elaine. All of her suggestions are getting overwhelmed by better suggestions, but at every moment Elaine is mature enough to say, yeah, but she was right. And let me tell you, when I was 17, I was not mature enough to say, yeah, but she was right. So honestly, if anything, I give Robert Jordan, like, he should lose credit for not writing teenagers accurately enough, even though I think this is really well drawn.
Well, and it fits so well. We've seen that exact kind of like our characters are naive, are naive, and
Yep.
the older characters are smarter. And there's a little of that going on with Matt and Tom with the Stones game. Spoiler for second half of this episode. And just all the other groups. It's like there's always a kind of mentor figure, right? And
Yep.
sometimes our characters just haven't been out and haven't experienced the world. So it's a version of that. And if you put it into the context of this ongoing tension, then of course it makes Egwene matter. And you're right that Elaine has shown the maturity to just, and maybe that's her royal bearing, right?
Yep.
Diplomacy and understanding that you listen to who's in the room and so on. Um, that was not a case for like the genetics of royal rule, but more like grooming to be
Yeah.
royal. Go for it.
So I think we've done a pretty good job, to my mind, of thinking about kind of the early and middle sections of this chapter, right? Where we get some of the Egwene Nynaeve conflict, where we get Mother Gwenna and we get, the discussion about herbs, which I found equally impenetrable. I get absolutely nothing about thorn root versus whatever else. But I actually want to talk about something that I found interesting and you probably found impenetrable. We need to at least briefly talk about dreams, because Egwene has a couple of new ones that I don't think we've really had reference to before. So we get a reference to Master Luhan, who is a character we met all the way back in book 1 from the Two Rivers, who is being put in a trap by a white cloak as bait. Um, I had not seen that particular image before that I had noted, and so I think that is interesting, especially since we had been, I think, a couple of episodes thinking about when do we go back to the Two Rivers. The fact that we're starting to get hints at that, I think, is interesting. And then the other one, there's a reference to Perrin and a falcon, which we've seen before, but then also to Perrin choosing between the axe that he normally carries and a blacksmith's hammer. And I think that we have seen many visions of Perrin kind of choosing the axe or not the axe, but having the alternative now of a blacksmith's hammer, I think, is a new take on an image that we've maybe seen once or twice before. There's also a bit in there about Matt dicing with the Dark One, and then also Rand is reaching for Kalendor, and it is specifically identified as 6 women and 5 men who are standing around him, and one of the men is Baal-Zaman. So I think 3 interesting new visions. Any thoughts on any of them or your interpretations? I know you're not usually the dream reader among the two of us.
No, none. Let's move on. No, I'll play along and go for a couple things. You're right that I don't. I also don't recall hearing about Master Luhan. But Two Rivers has been dangled as under threat before, right? We in
Yeah.
some of the parallel dimensions we traveled through, I think, when we went through the stones at the end of the second book, there was one potentiality where Two Rivers was being like torn to shreds and such.
Yeah.
So I think of Two Rivers a lot like I thought about the Shire in Lord of the Rings, which is just this idyllic place, and the reason we do it all, but like blissfully separate. And so
Okay.
to have this hint that the Shire is being scored. Take that, book movie fans. That's a book reference. That there is this place can be lost, and if we lose the continent, we lose everything. But a more specific threat, the White Cloaks we know have the information of these individuals of note. Why wouldn't they go try to create a trap for it? I was struck because you and I just before the recording started talked a lot about the chapter titles for next week, and one of them is bait and trap, which I was like, uh-oh. Now that you point out the vision.
I'd also like to point out the other is the hammer. Like, they are
Exactly,
all
yes.
in these dreams.
So interesting, and sorry to preview that for listeners. I imagine this like pure listener who's like, I only read the chapter, I don't look at anything else, don't reference everything. I don't think you exist, imaginary listener, but apologies all the same if you do. um
No
so
apologies from me. If you're that strict, you can deal.
so I think that strikes me as there's probably something going on there. And boy, could that derail a confrontation in tier very quickly if our characters need to run off and go save the two rivers. We do still have vital characters there. Even if some of the ones that are vital there in the show don't exist in the books. I'm thinking of
Yep.
some sisters that
Yep.
Perrin had. Perrin
Matt.
Matt had things like that. But we know Rand's dad is there. We know Egwene's dad, right?
Both parents.
Or
Yeah.
both parents, yeah. Um, and then second, I really like what you said about the hammer versus the axe. And to me, those are literal, but they're also
Right.
figurative, right? So metaphorical, rather, perhaps more than figurative, which is an axe is destructive and a hammer is constructive. And so when you are choosing between destruction and construction, an act of creativity. So is it a life of peace, right? Beating the sword into a plowshare, or is it a life of war? And how will Perrin be
Yep.
making? I'm really having a Merry and Pippin night with those two. But how will Perrin, the tall one, make that choice and move forward? And that does make me think of the way of the leaf, right? That
Yeah.
the tinkerers are a more in the hammer. They're constructive folk. They're into
Yeah.
art and creation, not destruction and fighting, obviously. So I see that's the choice lying ahead of Perrin is what's he gonna do? Is he gonna keep fighting or is he gonna go try to build a life of peace somewhere? And I think that's always been kind of in play for
Yeah.
Perrin. I will say in my notes, the last one you mentioned, I just read that as the now I've forgotten their name, the Forsaken,
The
the
Forsaken. Yep.
yeah, the Forsaken, right? Okay, we had talked last time about how we've been collecting names. We're not totally sure who ranks in the Forsaken, who counts as that.
Yep.
I thought this meant we are building to 10 Forsaken plus Baal Zaman. And I do not think they will literally be standing around the Stone of Tyr, but they are figuratively standing around the Stone of Tyr as Rand goes to claim his right as the Dragon Reborn.
I have no corrections about your comments about either of those first two visions. Absolutely spot on. I think that your analysis of the third one nailed it with one exception, which is that we have had a reference to how many Forsaken there are. There are 13, but
Hmm.
Rand killed one and a tree killed one in the first book. So there would be 11 left, potentially including Baal
Baal
Zaman,
Zaman.
given this vision. So I think all of the like major stories you're telling about the dreams, yes, I'm curious to see how the specifics of those turn out. But in terms of Forsaken, 11, and it's worth noting 6 women, 5 men is at least good for counting purposes if we are figuring out like how many do we have left on our bingo cards or what have you. I think then if we have kind of done the early section of the chapter and we've done the middle with Mother Gwenna, we are left with one of my least favorite plays of recent years, The Slap.
I mean, okay.
Yeah.
It felt like this is where we were brewing towards, and they weren't going to do the barrel of water.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have that much to say about it. I don't think it's. I think I all of this drama feels like in the moment, and when stuff hits the fan, they're going
Yeah.
to throw it all behind them. I don't see this as a breaking point for this pair, but
Yeah.
the tension will fade away and then come back and so on. So the only other thing in my notes, and please make a point about the slap if you want to.
Yeah.
I will say the only other thing is I thought they gave up a lot of information to Mother Gwenna very quickly and very
Yeah.
trusting, and that made me a little nervous. In with that, there was a reminder at one point about the oaths, which I was
Yeah.
like, oh, I forgot they are bound by the oaths now, so that felt relevant.
Just to
Not
be
bound
very
by them.
careful. Yes, have been told to follow the oaths, but they are not bound by the oaths in the way
Mm.
that Aes Sedai are, like magically bound.
Okay. So a reminder of that, and then just the hint that they were pushing the limits,
Yeah.
but I think the key for me is like, well, I hope this woman is good because
Yeah.
they gave up a lot and they're trusting her a lot, including living in her home and eating her food and so on. So I'm a little nervous about that because I'm not convinced Mother Gwenna is on the level.
100%. And I think the version of that that stood out to me the most is early in this chapter. Nynaeve makes reference to asking Mother Gwenna what the weather is going to be like the next day, and she very clearly distances herself from that. And this is actually something that is referenced a couple times in this chapter that might not be obvious if it's your first time through. Channeling is illegal in Tyr. And
Hmm.
so Mother Gwenna is very obvious very quickly. She is like, I am not channeling. I cannot predict the weather. Only people who want to get in trouble with the law do that. And so there is actually a moment, I think, I forget if it's at the end of this chapter or the beginning of the next one, where Nynaeve, in the middle of her conversation with Mother Gwenna, mentions that it is going to rain tomorrow. And that was the moment for me that stood out as careless, right? I think Nynaeve,
Hmm.
you're exactly right, is giving away maybe too much information, but she's at least kind of skirting the three oaths in a way where it's non-specific information or maybe non-identifying information. But hey, I can do that thing that you just denied earlier because it's illegal is a weird slip up to make in the middle of
Hmm.
a situation like this. My only other comment re Slapgate is I understand that Egwene probably deserved to be slapped, but that was a sick burn. Like, you need to give her credit for it. If you want to take
Hmm.
down Nynaeve a peg, compare her to Moraine. Solid work by Egwene. I shouldn't be taking her side in this, but good work. Any last thoughts on the chapter before we switch over to the next?
No, because in part because it just kind of continues into the next. So
Yeah.
I say hit us with your summary, but we covered my notes.
Chapter 49, A Storm in Tyr. So we literally pick up like 5 seconds later. Egwene realizes that Elaine was probably right to slap her, but she can't bring herself to apologize. After a few moments, Julian, who I will note, I think is wearing a fez, even though his hat is only very briefly described,
Hmm.
he enters and says that he will help them, but he says that the High Lords are probably going to have need of him soon. When he's kind of pushed by this on Mother Gwenna, he says that he's seen men on the roofs recently. They've been hiding, and he's had difficulty seeing them because they've been hiding so well. And so, even if they haven't been any thefts that have been reported yet, Julian is pretty solid that he is going to be called on because he thinks of himself as the best of the thief catchers. We learn that Julian is apparently a flirt, but otherwise is very reliable, and that he is not able to carry a sword in the city, despite the fact that he often works for the High Lords, and that really only foreigners ever have swords in the city. Otherwise, it is pretty heavily restricted. Nynaeve offers Julian more money than he initially asked for. She gives him a warning about the danger that he is in, and she asks him to only find the women rather than to try to bring them in himself. He agrees after telling a brief story about the last time that he actually trusted that a woman was less dangerous than a man. He says that he will treat the women as if they were of the Black Aja, and very quickly, once Nynaeve kind of impresses upon him the danger, he leaves on his search. The girls relax for a little while with Nynaeve talking to Mother Gwenna and predicting the weather, with Egwene not being able to focus even though she's trying to read. Elaine is doing some kind of stitching. Eventually, they go to bed, and Egwene says that she is going to use the ter'angreal and that she is to be woken in an hour. Nynaeve asks if she is uneasy or if she's using the ter'angreal too much, and Egwene basically admits internally that she knows she's sulky, that Nynaeve has reason to doubt, and then she immediately falls asleep. She tries to get herself to go to the Stone of Tyr. We learn that she has learned a little bit about the rules of how Tylor and Riod work, and she makes herself appear in the Stone of Tyr where Kalendor is, and very quickly she sees that there are the 13 women that she has been chasing, among them Leandrin, who turns and smiles at her, and then she wakes up and asks herself, how in the world did I manage to wake up?
Hmm.
And then we switch into Matt's POV. Matt is playing stones with Tom and lamenting how long the trip is taking, despite the fact that the ship is going extremely quickly. Tom barely ever loses at stones, but says Matt could be good if he tried, and says that Morgaze was his equal, and that generally generals and people who are good at the great game are the best at stones. The captain arrives and announces that they have gotten to Tyr. Matt pays him and then immediately takes off his cloak and uses it to wrap the fireworks because he, quote, did a test with a bucket and realized that you can't get fireworks wet and expect them to still explode. He also notes that Rand's father was right about the reason you don't get fireworks wet. And then Matt says that and then Tom starts asking him about the fireworks, and Matt says that he will not sell them until he knows how they work. And also, wouldn't it be fun to set them all off in one place, which horrifies Tom. Tom asks kind of what is going on with Matt, says that he's been off, and Matt says that it's all for a wager. They try to find an inn. Very quickly they do, and then immediately they start searching, despite the fact that it is pouring rain and Tom has a persistent cough that doesn't seem to go away. They go to a number of different inns, and at each of them, they do a little bit of gambling. Tom does a little bit of performing, and it's worth noting that Tom is not drinking as much as he was. He's only having a few sips here and there at each of the inns. It seems as if they are not getting anywhere. They are getting soaked. They are getting tired until eventually Matt says just one more inn and picks a random one. They walk inside and immediately they see the person who they are looking for. This is Sergeant Komar. He is brandishing his dice cup and challenging anyone who will come. He has apparently been winning all night with basically the same rolls every time, although everyone seems to be using the same dice, and so no one seems to be thinking that he has weighted dice, although Tom very quickly proves that theory incorrect by showing how easy it is to swap out one set of dice for another. Matt decides to go and gamble with the man. He rolls the dice and immediately rolls the best roll possible, despite the fact that he was using the weighted dice that shouldn't have rolled that well. And after a brief confrontation, Matt kicks the guy, tells him he knows that about the girls, and apparently breaks the man's back accidentally. The innkeeper tells Matt to run, and not before Matt, however, learns that Komar had not found the girls, but that others are also searching for them. Matt leaves along with Rand, although the innkeeper also says that he will give someone else's description and then gives Rand's description, saying that it was someone who he saw in a dream the night before. Matt and Tom make their way out, and Tom seems to be getting worse and worse. They rest and they search for several days, not seeming to find anything other than rumors and having many dreams of Rand. But Matt keeps telling himself he intends to win. And that's the chapter. This is an odd one for me, in part because of what you said as we transitioned into the chapter. Why was the first half of this chapter not part of the previous one? And then we get Matt in the storm and Tyr, the thing that the chapter is actually named after. I don't mind either half of it. It's just odd organization from my perspective. What was your take on this chapter that I think has two maybe interesting small through lines, but feels slight because it's two halves instead of a whole?
Yeah, actually, the way you just described that made me think about we watch, shows on streaming services like, every other human. But we pay the lower price for the ad tiers, and they stick the ads in, and the editing is so terrible. You a character's in the middle of a sentence, and then the ad pops in, and then you wait till 90 seconds of pharmaceutical ads, and then it's like the end of the sentence. And so it felt kind of like that. You're right. It's like, we didn't quite cut this in correctly. I'm very curious now that like Disney Plus is adding ads. It's like those shows weren't even supposed to have ads. How do you just cut them in? They'll do a terrible job, I'm sure. I will say it felt a little like that. I was shocked how long your summary went, and either I'm bad at taking notes this chapter. I kind of thought this was a nothing burger of a chapter. Like it's important to move things around and continue on, but I didn't have nearly as much written down. You kept going, and at one point I'd made a note down here on the side, and I was like, oh God, he's still in the first half of the chapter. I missed a lot of this or something. But I think it's probably an example of our classic plot heavy
Yeah.
analysis light. I would say a couple things that feel important here. Probably you're right, one on each of these characters. So for Egwene, I'll just tackle the first half. Egwene, it feels important to know that she is working hard on this problem still and has advanced her skills with
Yeah.
the Teleron Riyadh. But
Riode.
Riode. But it also felt like all that really matters is she's not invisible in that space, right?
Yeah.
This connection to Leandrin, we could read that as a symbol or a metaphor, but it felt to me like, no, that's very clearly like, nope, you're visible here.
Yeah.
And so I think that's probably my big takeaway from the whole first half. And I really don't think I wrote anything else down.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you've identified the key takeaway here, right? The girls at the end of the chapter, I think Egwene says something like, "I think I know why we have to be here," and that feels like what this is, right? Is these girls have been running after an unknown, and we kind of knew what was going on. We've seen so many dreams and visions about Rand walking into a trap. We know what is going on in Tyr, but it's easy to forget the girls don't, right? They have basically no clue whatsoever that Rand is anywhere near this side of the continent. And so for them, the fact that it is the Black Aja who are setting a trap, they're like, oh, we've been getting a bunch of weird random messages about a trap, and now I get it. So this feels like one of those moments where like dramatic irony almost cuts against us, right? This should be a really big dramatic reveal, but I kind of got it. Like
Yeah.
I knew this is where this was going because we had been reading the other parts of the story. That is one of my two big things in the first half of this chapter. The second half, or the other thing that I have in the first half, I'm sorry, is Julian. We have a new character. He seems relatively important. Of the two, you had said like Aelwyn or Mother Gwenna seemed like the kind of more important of the two. I maybe would have circled Julian's name instead. I'm curious your thoughts on the new character or anything about, the dream stuff.
Yeah, I would say Julian was definitely on my mind as well. This is the Janna to the Zori Bliss of the last chapter.
Yep.
Just really going all in on Rise of Skywalker because why not make references to the things Star Wars fans don't even tend to like? But
Hey now.
easy. I know you're not that. But I will say, definitely felt also the small clues that he's very honorable when
Yeah.
Nynaeve is like, we'll pay you this extra money. He's like, I don't need extra money. Don't worry about it. Like,
Yeah.
just a man of honor. It's like, okay, he's got enough of a personality. He doesn't feel like an NPC. He feels like somebody who will come back up in this and be a part of it. So I would also say that I didn't realize until your description he was wearing a fez. So now I'm just going to picture Sala from Raiders of the Lost Ark
I like it.
/ Last Crusade
Hey.
/ Dial of Destiny. What? Oh, spoilers.
I think short conical hat is the way they describe it, but that's a fez in my world. Like, I don't see anything else that could fit that. I guess then what we're saying is new character, yay.
I
Greg
had a
has
fez.
just put on his fez that he had from an old D&D game where I handed out hats.
Wow.
That's awesome.
It was in reach. I was like, how is this happening in my life right now? All right, go on.
I think that we have kind of covered the first half of this chapter is just the wrap up from the previous chapter. I think the big thing here is we have a new character and he is now searching for the Black Aja. And then, as you said, the girls now know they're linked to the Black Aja and their part in kind of this broader tapestry. In that case, Matt and Tom. I think the first thing I have is something you had called out in the earlier discussion of the previous chapter. This Stones game feels like a metaphor that keeps coming up. And when someone who we are told is a master who basically never loses and was 50-50 against one of the great players, when they tell one of our characters, hey, you could be great at this, and generals and politicians are great at it, I feel like that tells us that Matt is going to be a great general or a great politician. He is about as good at stones, or could be, as I am at ignoring Greg doing silly things with his hat while I'm trying to make a serious point.
I think that's exactly right. I still had a little bit of witch Matt, right? Because we do know that this other identity that came with his good luck also was a general or a leader of some kind, maybe not all the way up to general. So I wondered, is he getting good at this from that? But I agree that we are often getting portends of where these characters will end up, and that's exciting. And again, one of the things I think I said way back when we started this project is I'm excited to see like a lifetime in these books. And we are now nearing the end of our third, and we've got about a year and a half, so a lifetime might be too much, but a long period of time. I am unusual in that I love Dickens, and I love modern writers who pretend to be Dickens and do like the birth to death novel of a character. And I love spending that long with characters if I've come to appreciate them.
Yeah.
And not a lot of people are doing that anymore. And it's an old fashioned style of writing. Although I do think of like now I'm gonna forget Robert Kirkman with
Oh
Walking
yeah.
Dead. His goal, I don't know how he's doing because I gave up, but his goal was like, I want to make 100 trade paperbacks worth of this comic book on a shelf. I'm just gonna stick with these characters.
Yeah.
When I gave up somewhere in the 20s, I think
Yeah.
it's still going, but it is really cool to think about how when we stay with characters long, something like this could become there.
Yeah.
I will then just add to your mix the fact that Morgaze, we talked a lot about Morgaze
Yep.
last episode, and it's just a confirmation again. Tom trusts her. Tom thinks she's brilliant. I'm again saying Robert Jordan. This is what you said, where Robert Jordan says the same thing 5 times so that you remember one of them. And
Yep.
now it was standing out in my mind, and so I think continue to believe in Morgaze and see the game happening. My big revelation from the chapter, and I'll transition us forward with
Yep.
this one, in its related point, is that we finally get this clue that Matt's luck has to rely on something random,
Random.
right?
Yep.
And so the stone skill is not that is actually skill. But we asked last time when this kind of other identity fades back and when it comes forward, and it seems to be when there's something random going on.
Yeah, I really like the version of this that we get kind of towards the end of the chapter, where searching every inn provides absolutely no benefit, but picking one of three, well, that's something that could go wrong or could go right. And so he's going to get an advantage on it. And so this is just, it's a fun little detail for Matt that he is bad at things when he puts too much effort and planning into it. Like, man, that's a great characteristic for a wild card of a character. Like, bravo, Robert Jordan. That's the power all Han Solos should have.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I land on the second half of the chapter. This is really fun and a good time, and I like the confrontation. I like the hint somebody else like that Connor
Komar, I think.
Komar is not the only one hunting the girls. So hey, there's more danger, there's more tension. But then all I said at the end of my page is like, everybody's headed to the stone, and we've got everybody moving that way. So that's exciting, but I don't really have anything else pithy to say about it.
Yeah, I think to me, the only thing that really stands out in this chapter, other than, like you say, kind of the details that we're getting in terms of where this is going, who's looking for the girls, those are, the important plot details. For me, it's Tom has a past, right? I don't think court bards would probably typically know how to cheat at dice games, and so I think there's hints of him having more than he's let on in what's been going on in his past. And
like in Rise of Skywalker, how Poe Dameron reveals he had a criminal background. He knew how to jumpstart tread tracks, and
you have a single metaphor, and we are hitting it every time. I love it.
Take that, dead horse.
Solid work. I think that stands out to me in this section. And then the other one that like really is just bizarre to me is Robert Jordan is just so done with writing action scenes at this point that he's just like, okay, Matt kicks the guy and his back breaks, I guess. Like, doesn't even reach for his quarterstaff, just ends the fight with a single kick. I think you could probably say, like, yeah, it was totally random that his back broke like that, but it's That's an odd cop out for not writing the half a page in action sequence, as far as I'm concerned. Was there anything kind of in this kind of action at the inn sequence? For me, it was the swapping out the dice of it that really stood out as the fun moment. Was there anything in there that you kind of like were latching onto as the fun that got you through kind of an exposition-y section?
I the other note in my notebook is I just wrote TikTok, which I think is trying to go after Jason Mantzoukas in the John Wick movies. But it just felt like everything is TikTok, like we're going to the confrontation. And so I would say
Yeah.
that tension and that kind of propulsive drive is what kept me reading through the exposition
Yeah.
and maybe made me gloss over some of it. I'm like, come on, let's get to the stone. Let's do this. And,
Yeah.
I think the storm helps with that too, because storms are when cool things happen. And
Yeah.
so it just feels like now the storm is upon us. It's time for the action. And like you said, I looked up in the corner of my page and it's like under 100 pages. And all I want to do is go upstairs right now and read. But I know that will make our episode next week really bad because I won't remember things a week from now. But I still might do it.
There's this amazing thing that I've done where you read these books like 20 times and then you remember them even if you read it a week in advance. It's lovely.
Nice.
Uh, I think the last just tiny note that I have here is I think it is kind of like a record scratch moment when the innkeeper is like, "Don't worry, I'll lie to the cops. I'll just tell them you are
Mm.
this guy who looks exactly like your best friend." Like it, it's a solid moment for me that I wasn't expecting, right? We've been getting all of these hints about High Lord Brend and Simone and all of these like dark forces getting into people's minds. And it's really easy to forget that this entire book began with Rand sharing his dreams with the Shinarans.
Mm.
So I think that kind of really brings us back into where we are when it's really easy to get lost and like Rand hasn't been on screen for 150 pages.
Oh, you just took my joke because I was going to say Rand. Who is that? What is who's this Rand you talk of? Boy, and I understand. I don't think book one dragged as much for me as it did you or a dear friend of ours who gave up on the series but has now been reading it voraciously every
Yep.
chance he gets. And yet it is a stark contrast now to see that we're really filling in this supporting cast and, like you said, a long time not appearing at all, but then also like since he was the center of the story, I would say the whole book, right?
Yeah.
500 whatever pages, 70 pages without him, it would seem. So yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, and I think to some degree where I'm at is let's get there, right? We have 3 weeks left. It's almost time. That this is the moment where I'm like, okay, Robert Jordan, you are stretching out the tension as much as you can, but we are running out of book. Let's do it. And I don't know that we entirely do in the next 2 weeks, which is
Mm.
both fun and not the best preview. Next week, we have chapter 50, The Hammer, and chapter 51, Bait for the Net. And let me say, I can't promise big action. I can't promise that the epic climax begins, but The Hammer is one of my favorite chapters in this
Mm.
series. So I think we've got some good stuff coming up. Greg, I'm going to drop a juicy detail and then let you take us out of the episode. What are you looking forward to with only 3 weeks left?
Based on you saying that, I'm going to assume it's Perrin
Yep.
next week. So I'm looking forward. I'm actually more than anything looking forward to our characters coming back together. There is something really nice in these big sprawling fantasy books where you get a giant cast and it's fun to put them all in different threads, but it's always good when they come back together. And I think the end of book two proved really fulfilling in that way. And I'm curious if this will feel as fulfilling, especially because of the tick tock of that page number up in the corner. And we're running
Yeah.
out of time. And we'll I also will say I remember early on, I think it was my brother-in-law, but somebody else who loves these books said it really was going to be a trilogy, and then it was decided it could be much, much bigger and more sprawling.
Yeah.
That to me says don't expect the end of a trilogy here. It's gonna not be the end because they knew by the time they were at the end of this. And I guess we won't see next time, but we will see in some future episode through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.